Oh, g'day mate. Today I'm going to talk to you about the settings that I use on the GoPro Hero 8 Black Edition. Right, let's get into it. So I've had my GoPro Hero 8 for probably about 3 months, and a little bit of a backstory. So when I first got it, I previously had a GoPro Hero 4 Black Edition, so it's pretty old. And when I got this new one, I thought, right, I need to try and use it to its full capacity, figure out exactly what frame rate to use, what angle, what clip, what, 4K, 1080, 3.7, 2. I don't know. It was quite overwhelming. So I trolled through YouTube and had a different look at what other people were doing, different opportunities, different examples, and I probably found that it was a little bit of a struggle. So I've sort of had to go through a little bit of trial and error with different sports that I've been doing, different angles, different activities, and I've probably learnt the hard way by going back, looking at my footage and realizing, shit, that was just terrible, or I had it angled the wrong way, or I had the wrong frame rate, or it just, didn't really look too good. So it's taken me a long time to get to this point now where I feel confident enough to tell you what works for me, and hopefully this will work for you too. Okay, so first off I'm going to start with the vlogging style. This is probably the easiest one. The settings that I use for that is 4K, I go super view, and then I have it on 60 frames per second. So there's not, to be honest, you could probably film your vlogging style stuff in any frame rate because it's going to look good. It's only really framing it up with yourself talking to the camera. It's not exactly an action clip. It's just pretty much just there's your camera, point and shoot, talk to it. Your microphone will pick up all your sound. Pretty basic really. So here's a couple of examples of different vlogging styles that I have used. The first one here. Now, as I said before, with it being winter, I'm still just running the 4.3 wetsuit. But my strategy in the coming weeks is probably I'm gonna have to get some sort of gloves. Oh, g'day mate, welcome to Lake Linden. So this is a lake that's about an hour away from Christchurch and it is on the way to Lake Brunner. So the settings I used for this was 4K super view, and that was 60 frames per second. I typically like to use the vlogging style when I'm talking to the camera. I like to have that as sharp and as crisp as possible. You could film that in 1080p or 1080, I don't even know what it's called, 1080 at 120 frames per second. You don't need it at 120 frames per second because all you really need is just a crisp shot that will pick up your sound, because the sound is the more important stuff when you're doing the vlogging style and you're talking to the camera. Alright, so now let's get into the action stuff. So this first clip, so this is using the narrow lens. Now I use my GoPro mainly for wakeboarding, a little bit of mountain biking as well. So when I brought the GoPro I thought, the zoom on the GoPro is crap. And if you mount it from the tower or the boat, you can pick it up, but it's not the greatest basically. So what I used for this is I used narrow lens. I try and avoid the zoom altogether. I find that the zoom really pixelates things. It makes it look a little bit average. It's not actually that good. So this is narrow, and I have this one on 1080 at 120 frames per second, and that will get you that nice crisp slow motion shot. So here's a couple of clips of the narrow lens mounted from the front of the boat. You can probably make the connection that the zoom on the narrow lens is probably similar to the zoom on a standard iPhone when you're in the video mode. In fact, the iPhone's possibly slightly closer. It's not actually a bad thing when it comes to the GoPro getting a wider angle because it sort of shows a little bit more of the background. As opposed to just honing in on the target. So sometimes you want a little bit of a mixture of both. Okay, so next up we have the sort of helmet mount or the point of view shot. So firstly, the settings I use for that are, I go super view. Always super view. That will get you the biggest angle from potentially whether or not you're wakeboarding or snowboarding or mountain biking. So hopefully from your subject, so if you're mountain biking, you want to have your front wheel, you want to have your hands on the handlebar, you want the foreground, so the road, and then ideally you want a little bit of the background, so that could be your mountains, your tracks, whatever. So this one, I find it is crucial to use the hyper smooth, and I put the boost on. So when you have the boost on, that means that you can't go at the highest frame rate of say 4K at 60 frames per second. You could only do 4K at 30 frames per second with the boost on. But I typically stay away from 4K when it comes to the action stuff, because if you want to slow it down, you're not going to get that really smooth slow motion shot. So for this shot here, see how we go. All right, start with the back roll. Good. I have gone with the 1080, 120 frames per second. I've gone with hyper smooth boost on, but the key thing here is the placement of the camera. So if you're someone who has it mounted to your helmet, this is probably a bad example on the hat, but if it is sort of pointing straight, then you're going to miss that whole sort of subject that you've got, which is either your wakeboard handle or your mountain bike handle or whatever, handlebars, sorry. So what you need to do, it's surprising how far forward you actually need to tilt it. So it's kind of a bad example, but what you probably need to do is you need to tilt it down to almost, it's further than what you think. The best bit of advice there, so get your app up, get the connect to camera, get the live feed going on it, and just do a couple of trials. So put your hands up, whether you're holding onto the wakeboard handle or handlebars of your bike or whatever. Keep tilting it until you're happy with the shot, and then what you do is you just make a note of that. I even take a photo of that with my iPhone. So then when you come to actually mount it when you are out on the boat or on the bike or whatever, you know exactly how far to tilt it forward. But you'll be surprised how much it sort of angles down, but the super view will still capture a pretty good sort of image in front of you. So much further down than what you think. But like I say, go to the GoPro app, check that out, get your live feed, do a few tests. That'll help you out massively. All right, next up, this is all about the slow motion stuff. So if you're into a little bit of the cinematic stuff, I'm not saying this is really cinematic, but it just looks a little bit crisper. The image is a whole lot more stabilized. The subjects are clear, precise. You know, it just looks quality. Anyway, here's some examples of some slow motion stuff. Now you can probably tell from that slow motion footage that it looks, let's just claim it, it looks like I'm using a gimbal, but clearly I'm not. So the frame rate for this is 120 frames per second, and I'm using 1080. Now what you're going to also have with that is you're going to put it onto slow motion. So the slow motion thing is key here, because that will really sort of hone in on your subject and make it look a lot smoother than potentially what you're filming is. So what I find with the slow motion stuff is that you actually don't really need the boost or the hyper smooth on. Sure, it helps, but most of the time I actually won't have it. I'll just have 1080 at 120 frames per second, and then the boost will sometimes automatically come on yourself because it's going into the slow motion stuff. I have probably avoided the 240 frames per second for a reason, and the reason is because you can't use hyper smooth or you can't use boost. It just doesn't look quite right. So sometimes the 240 frames per second and 1080, that would be best if your GoPro is sitting there and mounted. So for example, it might be a skateboarder going past, the GoPro is not moving and the subject is coming into the shot, as opposed to having it mounted to your chest or helmet or wrist or whatever, and it's sort of all over the show. So the 240 frames per second, best when it is mounted, locked, and not able to go anywhere. Like I say, skateboarder, BMXer, whatever, even just anything really coming into shot. Okay, so they are the settings that I use for my activities of wakeboarding and snowboarding. The best bit of advice I can give you, it's trial and error. You have to put the time in to figure out which angle and which shot and which frame rate is best for your activity. Best way you can do that is through the app. Yes, you're going to have times where you go out and do something epic and you go back and have a look at it and you think, damn it, the footage is crap because you didn't either have the right settings or you didn't have it mounted in the right spot. So do the mahi beforehand to hopefully eliminate the possibility of missing out on some good shots because the settings were wrong. So thanks for watching. Make sure you hit subscribe, hit the thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.